So now, once you're ready, if it spreads a lot, this means that you have a problem. Something was wrong during the meringue preparation, the mixing, or the baking. Then the outside, the exterior has to be uniformly colored. There should be no brown or dark spots. The color should be uniform everywhere. The macaron has to have no hollows or no gaps inside. When you break the macaron open, once it is baked, it should be full, without any air pockets, nothing like this. So to achieve all this, we need to follow some guidelines, how to bake the macarons perfectly. I wish the ultimate temperature existed, but unfortunately all the ovens are different, the climate conditions are different, the ingredients are different, and that's why the baking time and the baking temperature will always be different depending on the oven and the country you work in. So there is one thing I recommend keeping in mind. Baking macarons is no different to baking cakes. When you bake a cake, it has to rise first. The same thing works for macarons. They have to rise and develop the feet. Then the cake has to stabilize. It has to set and not collapse. And again, same thing works for macarons. This is why the same rule applies for baking macarons as for baking cakes. When you bake small sponges, thin sponges, it is recommended you bake them at higher temperatures for a shorter period of time. It works for macarons too, but the temperature range is slightly different. So normally for thin sponges, it is recommended to bake them at about 180 to 200 degrees Celsius. It might work for macarons, but the problem is that the surface will get browned too much. So in our case, we'll bake them at a relatively high temperature, about 160 degrees Celsius, so that they have enough temperature to be able to rise well. And then, depending on your oven, you might need to drop the temperature at some point, or even in the beginning of baking, so that the macarons do not discolor during baking. So the goal is to flash the macarons at a relatively high temperature for a few minutes first, so that they have enough temperature to rise, so there is enough steam generated for them to rise, and then continue baking at a slightly lower temperature to set the structure of the macaron and make them look beautiful, so they don't collapse or they don't rise too much and brown prematurely. So the temperature I work with in this particular oven is the following. I preheat the oven to 165 degrees Celsius. For about 10 minutes, it gets heated really well. Then I put the tray with macarons inside the oven and I drop the temperature to 140 degrees Celsius. Like this, the temperature drops gradually during baking. The macarons have enough temperature to rise well and then set well, so that they are tall enough with a well-developed interior. Such temperature range might not work in your oven, but the thing you need to understand is if you want the macaron with no hollows inside, you need to bake them at a high temperature. Relatively high, I mean. It is not 120, not 130 degrees Celsius. It is the same as with cakes and sponges. If you want them to rise, you need to apply heat, and this heat has to be sufficient. And if there is not enough heat, the cake will collapse or not rise at all. So the same rule works with the macarons too. If you want them rise and if you want them be properly filled with no gaps and no hollows inside, then you need to apply more heat. I would recommend the range from 140 to 165 degrees Celsius. Then regarding convection and no convection. Well, it depends on the oven. You can achieve good results both in the convection oven like this, which bakes with the fan on, and with the oven which has no convection at all. I would recommend baking at lower temperatures from 140 to 150 degrees Celsius in convection ovens, because the airflow produces lots of heat and this heat is distributed evenly throughout the baking chamber, while in conventional ovens with no fan, I recommend baking at higher temperatures so that the macaron has enough temperature to rise and enough temperature to set during baking. Now, another point to discuss is the baking time. It will always be different as well, but the general time for macarons to be ready is about 10 to 15 minutes. Again, it will depend on the oven greatly. If the oven is powerful and bakes fast, then the macarons will be ready faster. If it is a home oven with no convection, then the baking time might be longer, up to 20 minutes. And if you load the oven completely with all the trays available, then again the baking time will increase up to 25-30 minutes even.